It started with a handmade bookmark I found tucked inside a library book, and it changed the way I saw my entire neighborhood. I'd just moved to Cedar Falls 3 weeks earlier, taking over my aunt's old Victorian house after she'd moved to Florida. The place still smelled like her lavender sachets, and I was drowning in boxes trying to make sense of a new job, a new town, and the peculiar loneliness that comes with starting over at 35. The loneliness hit hardest in small moments. Like that morning at Miller's Cafe when I'd tried to strike up a conversation with the woman behind the counter about the weather. She'd smiled politely but rushed off to handle the morning rush before I could say more than, "Sure is getting cold." I'd sat there with my coffee, watching locals chat with easy familiarity, feeling like I was watching life through a window. I'd almost talked myself out of taking the community center job, spent a whole night staring at the acceptance email, wondering if teaching art to seniors was really going to be my fresh start, or just another reminder that I didn't know anyone here. But something, maybe desperation, maybe hope, made me hit send. That Tuesday morning, I'd escaped to the public library just to feel like I was somewhere that made sense. The heavy wooden doors groaned as I pushed them open, and I was immediately wrapped in the familiar smell of old paper and lemonwood polish. My footsteps echoed on the worn hardwood floors, each creak a small announcement of my presence in the hushed space. The library was one of those old Carnegie buildings with tall windows that caught the morning light and made dust motes dance like tiny celebrations. I'd grabbed a mystery novel off the staff picks shelf without really looking at it, just needing something to fill the quiet hours before my first day at work the next morning. As I checked out, I noticed the librarian slip something into another patron's book, a flash of painted color, but thought nothing of it. When I opened the novel at home that evening, curled up in Aunt Helen's reading chair with a cup of chamomile tea, a bookmark fluttered onto my lap. It wasn't just any bookmark. Someone had painted a tiny watercolor sunset on thick cardstock, with delicate brushstrokes that turned orange into pink into purple. At the bottom, in careful cursive, were the words, "Every ending is also a beginning. Keep going." I turned it over. On the back was written, "If you found this, it was meant for you. Pass it on when you're ready. The Bookmark Lady." Something about those words made my throat tight. Here I was, dealing with the ending of my life in Chicago. The job I'd lost, the relationship that had fizzled, the apartment I'd given up, and a stranger had left me exactly what I needed to hear. I tucked the bookmark into the novel and decided that maybe, just maybe, Cedar Falls might surprise me. The next morning was my first day at the Cedar Falls Community Center, where I'd be teaching art classes to seniors. I was nervous in that first day of school way, my hands shaking slightly as I arranged paintbrushes and set out watercolor palettes. The room smelled of tempera paint and coffee from the pot someone had left brewing in the corner. I could hear the soft classical music from the Tai Chi class next door, mixing with distant laughter from somewhere down the hall. My first student arrived 15 minutes early. A woman in her 70s with silver hair swept up in an elegant bun and paint already somehow splattered on her purple cardigan. Her hands, I noticed, were stained with what looked like watercolor paint, blues and purples embedded in the creases of her fingers. "You must be Emma," she said, extending one of those paint-marked hands. She wore several artistic rings that clinked softly as we shook. "I'm Dorothy. I've been taking art classes here for 10 years, so if you need to know where anything is, just ask. Harold keeps the good brushes locked in the supply closet, but I know where he hides the key." As she settled at her usual spot, I watched her pull something from her enormous handbag, several somethings actually, and tuck them into various pockets. They looked like bookmarks, but she moved so quickly I couldn't be sure. By the time the class filled up, I had 12 seniors looking at me expectantly. There was Harold himself, who turned out to be the facilities manager and a secret artist. Margaret, who told me within 5 minutes that she'd been a court reporter for 40 years and was finally learning to paint because she'd spent enough time with words. Frank, a quiet man who set up his easel in the corner and nodded politely when introduced. "Today we're going to start with something simple," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "We're going to paint what makes us happy." The room filled with the gentle sounds of creativity. Brushes swishing in water jars, the soft scratch of bristles on paper, quiet murmurs of concentration. Someone hummed tunelessly. Harold's chair squeaked as he leaned back to examine his work. Dorothy raised her hand. "What if what makes us happy is complicated? Like my grandson finally calling after 6 months." "Then paint how that phone call felt," I suggested. "Maybe it felt like sunrise, or like doors opening, or like purple," Dorothy interrupted. "It felt like purple with gold edges." And just like that, the ice was broken. The room filled with chatter as everyone began mixing colors and sharing stories. Margaret painted her cat, but in shades of joy rather than realistic tabby stripes. Harold created an abstract piece that he said represented his wife's laugh. Frank, in the corner, was carefully painting what looked like a small library. As I walked around the room, offering suggestions and encouragement, I found myself thinking about the bookmark. These people were all dealing with their own endings and beginnings: retirement, loss, health challenges, family changes. But here they were, creating beauty on a Wednesday morning. After class, as I was cleaning brushes, Dorothy lingered behind. "You did well today," she said. "I know it's not easy, starting fresh. I moved here 40 years ago after my divorce, didn't know a soul. This place, these people, they become your family if you let them." "Thank you," I said, meaning it more than she could know. "Oh, before I forget." She reached into her enormous handbag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Welcome to town present, nothing fancy." I opened it after she left. Inside was a set of handmade bookmarks, each painted with a different tiny masterpiece: a sunrise, a cup of tea, a single flower, an open window. The note attached said, "For when you need to mark the good pages, D." My hands stilled on the bookmarks. The painting style was unmistakable. The same delicate brush strokes, the same attention to detail. Dorothy was the bookmark lady. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a routine. Art class on Wednesdays and Fridays, exploring the town in between, slowly unpacking both my boxes and my hesitation about starting over. I learned that Harold had been a mechanical engineer who'd discovered art after retirement. Margaret showed me pictures of her 6 grandchildren and always brought homemade cookies to share. Frank remained quiet, but his paintings grew more detailed each week, always buildings, always with careful attention to windows and doors. One Friday, about a month into teaching, I arrived to find my classroom in unusual chaos. Dorothy was gesticulating wildly while Harold tried to calm her down. Margaret was on her phone, looking worried. "What's wrong?" I asked. "It's Frank," Dorothy said. "He's in the hospital, had a fall yesterday, and his daughter says he's refusing visitors. Says he doesn't want to be a bother." The room fell quiet. Frank might have been reserved, but he was part of our little group. His empty easel in the corner looked wrong, like a missing tooth. "Well, that's ridiculous," Margaret announced, putting her phone away. "Since when do we let Frank decide what's a bother?" That's how I found myself part of a covert hospital visit that afternoon, armed with a watercolor set, a stack of Dorothy's bookmarks, and a determination matched only by 3 70-somethings who'd decided that no one gets left behind. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, that particular combination that makes you walk more quietly even when there's no reason to. The steady beep of monitors created an electronic heartbeat in the hallways. The air conditioning was set to Arctic, and I pulled my cardigan tighter as we navigated to room 302. Frank was there, looking smaller somehow in the hospital bed, his leg in a cast. His eyes widened when we trooped in. We know, Dorothy said, settling herself in the visitor's chair like she owned it. "You don't want visitors. Too bad," We're not visitors, we're artists, and we have a class to conduct." "Dorothy," Frank started, but Harold was already setting up a makeshift easel using the hospital tray table. "The assignment today," I said, playing along, "is to paint what we're grateful for. Small paintings only, because we don't want to disturb your roommate." Frank's roommate, it turned out, was delighted by the distraction. I watched him lean forward slightly, eyes following our movements with quiet curiosity as we transformed the sterile room into an impromptu studio. The smell of watercolors gradually overtook the antiseptic, and the beeping monitors became just another rhythm in our creative symphony. Within minutes, we had a full art class going in room 302, with even the nurses stopping by to see what we were doing. Frank protested for about 5 minutes before Dorothy handed him a brush. He hesitated, holding it like it might break, as if picking it up meant admitting he needed us. Then his fingers closed around it, and I saw his shoulders relax. "I'm grateful for interfering friends," Frank finally said, adding a tiny figure to the doorway of the building he was painting. Then, quietly, "and for people who don't let you disappear." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's what we do here, Frank. We show up." I thought about the bookmark tucked in my purse. Every ending is also a beginning. And realized Frank was living that truth right now, in this antiseptic-scented room that had become a studio. As we were packing up to leave, the nurses had been very patient, but visiting hours were ending. Frank called me back. "Emma," he said, "the buildings I paint, they're all places where I found help when I needed it. The library where someone taught me to read English when I first came to this country. The community center where I met my late wife at a dance. This hospital where my daughter was born." He paused. "I think I'll add this room to the list." I felt tears prick my eyes. "I'd like to see that painting when you're done." He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. "You will. Oh, and Emma, check the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet in our classroom. I left something there for the next teacher before you arrived. I think maybe you were meant to find it." Back at the community center, I went straight to the supply cabinet. In the bottom drawer was a wooden box filled with handmade bookmarks, each one painted with a different scene from Cedar Falls. The note on top read, "For new beginnings. Add your own when you're ready. F." I sat there on the floor of my classroom, surrounded by bookmarks painted by Frank, Dorothy, and who knew how many others, and finally understood. This wasn't just about bookmarks. It was about a whole town that had figured out how to catch people when they were falling, how to mark the important moments, how to ensure no one had to navigate their endings and beginnings alone. That weekend, I painted my first bookmark, a watercolor of the community center classroom with 12 easels arranged in a circle. On the back, I wrote, "You're exactly where you need to be." I left it in a cookbook at the grocery store, tucked between the pages of a recipe for starting over soup. Frank came back to class 3 weeks later, cast and all. Dorothy had organized a painting party in his honor, and Margaret baked a cake shaped like an artist's palette. Harold had even found an old wheelchair so Frank could navigate the community center more easily. "I have something to show you all," Frank announced at the end of class. He unveiled a painting of Hospital Room 302, but it wasn't the sterile, sad place I remembered. In his painting, light streamed through the windows, and the room was full of colors and tiny figures holding paintbrushes. In the doorway stood 4 people, and even though they were just suggestions of forms, I recognized us immediately. "I'm calling it The Day My Room Became an Art Studio," he said. Dorothy wiped her eyes with a paint-stained hand, leaving a streak of blue across her cheek. "Oh, Frank, it's perfect." As winter approached, our little art group grew. Word had spread about the seniors who'd turned a hospital room into an art class, and new people began showing up. Some were grieving, some were lonely, some were just looking for connection. We welcomed them all, and Dorothy always had extra bookmarks to slip into their bags when they weren't looking. I discovered that the bookmark lady wasn't just Dorothy. It was a whole network. Harold left them at the hardware store, Margaret at the cafe where she had coffee every morning. Frank had been leaving them at the library for years. Even some of my new students started making them, paying forward the small kindness that had welcomed them. One day, Mrs. Mills stopped me at Miller's Cafe, the same place where I'd felt so invisible that first week. "You're Emma from the art class," she said, clutching a familiar-looking bookmark. "I found this in my grocery cart last week. My husband just got diagnosed with Parkinson's, and I've been so scared. But this bookmark..." She trailed off, eyes wet. "Your Aunt Helen used to leave these around too. She trained at the hospital where my husband's being treated now. Small world." The connections kept revealing themselves like a watercolor painting emerging from wet paper. Unexpected, but somehow perfect. One evening in December, as snow began falling outside the community center windows, Dorothy stayed after class again. We'd been working on winter scenes, and the room smelled like pine from the branch Harold had brought in for inspiration, mixed with the ever-present scent of acrylic paint. "I need to tell you something," Dorothy said, settling into her usual chair. "About the bookmarks." I sat down across from her, waiting. "I started making them after my husband died," she continued. "Found myself in the library one day crying in the poetry section, feeling like I'd never be okay again. A stranger, never did learn her name, handed me a tissue and a bookmark. It just said, 'This too shall pass' on it. Nothing fancy, but it was exactly what I needed." She pulled out one of her painted bookmarks, studying it. "So I started making them, leaving them places where people might need to hear something kind. The library, the doctor's office, the grief support group meeting room. Then Frank started doing it, and Harold, and before we knew it, half the town was in on it." "It's beautiful," I said. "This whole secret network of kindness." Dorothy smiled. "Not so secret anymore. And now you're part of it too. I saw the one you left at the grocery store. Mrs. Mills found it and brought it to show me. She's been having a hard time since her husband's diagnosis. That bookmark made her cry, but in a good way." She paused, reaching into her bag again. "There's something else. Remember I told you I moved here after my divorce? Well, before that I lived in Chicago. Used to leave bookmarks at the Fullerton Library there. This was, 15 years ago now." My heart skipped. The Fullerton Library? I'd studied there all through graduate school. Dorothy continued, "I always wondered if any of those Chicago bookmarks found their right person. Guess now I know at least one did." I stared at her. "I found one. Years ago, during my worst semester of grad school. It was painted with stars and said, 'You're braver than you think.' I kept it for years until..." I stopped, remembering. "Until I gave it to a crying freshman at the library. Told her to pass it on when she was ready." Dorothy's eyes crinkled. The circle completes itself. As we locked up the community center that night, Dorothy pressed another bookmark into my hand. This one showed the northern lights dancing across a winter sky. "What's this for?" I asked. "Your Aunt Helen was one of the original bookmark makers," Dorothy said gently. "She'd be so proud to know you're carrying it on." I stood there in the snowy parking lot, staring at the bookmark, understanding flooding through me. Aunt Helen had left me more than just a house. She'd left me a place in this intricate web of connection and care. "She never mentioned it," I whispered. "That was Helen's way," Dorothy said. "Quiet kindness, but she made sure you'd land somewhere soft. That job posting at the community center, Helen might have had a word with Harold about it before she left." The tears came then, standing there in the December snow, holding a bookmark painted by the woman who'd become my friend. I wasn't just starting over in Cedar Falls. I was continuing something that had been waiting for me all along. "Thank you," I said, "for telling me, for all of it." Dorothy hugged me, smelling like oil paint and lavender. Welcome home, Emma. Really home. That was 6 months ago. Now, as I prepare for another Wednesday class, my supply drawer is full of bookmarks ready to find their homes. The art room fills with its familiar sounds. Water swishing in jars, brushes on paper, quiet laughter, the squeak of Harold's chair. Frank's added 12 new buildings to his collection, each one a story of connection. Margaret started teaching a writing class in the room next door, leaving bookmarks with bits of poetry and library books. Harold built a special display case for the community center lobby where people can take and leave bookmarks freely. Just this morning, I saw Mrs. Mills at the display case, carefully selecting a bookmark painted with morning glories. She caught my eye and smiled, that knowing smile of someone who's part of the secret. As she tucked it into her pocket and headed toward the exit, I remembered sitting in her cafe that first lonely week, feeling invisible behind my coffee cup. Now here we both were, part of this quiet chain that catches people in exactly those moments. She was probably on her way to leave that bookmark somewhere special, for someone who needed to know they weren't alone. The network keeps growing, one small kindness at a time. And me? I still have that first bookmark, the sunset one that started it all. It lives in my planner now, marking the day I arrived in Cedar Falls. Below the original message, I've added my own. You were right. This beginning is beautiful. Every ending is also a beginning. I know that now, not just as words on a bookmark, but as a truth I've lived. Cedar Falls taught me that. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples. A bookmark in a library book, a painting class that becomes a family, a town that catches you when you're falling and reminds you that every ending really is also a beginning. And now, whenever I see someone looking a little lost at the library or sitting alone at the cafe, I slip them a bookmark. Sometimes it's one of Dorothy's masterpieces, sometimes one of Frank's architectural gems, sometimes one of my own attempts, but always with the same message on the back. If you found this, it was meant for you. Because in Cedar Falls, nobody has to navigate their new chapters alone. We've got bookmarks for that. And if you've stayed with me to the last page of this story, maybe this one is meant for you. You're exactly where you need to be.